for example. You don't have to travel far, Joburg, to notice that there's a problem, there's unemployment. And I'd be quite keen to hear your observations about why the crisis in Spain is not as visible, or in Barcelona certainly, it's not as visible in ways that it is here. And also Devin's question about the mobilization of I don't know, dark sentiments, the mobilization of fascism as a response. I mean, what are the chances that the PP might, use the immigration issue, which, as we know, is quite a big issue at the moment in Spain, use that to retain power? This is a question I have for you. And Malus, you're going to have to forgive me. They say familiarity breeds contempt. This is not contempt, but it's discomfort. In some ways, my discomfort that your presentation is connected to some what Carl was saying yesterday about the ANC being the only game in town in this country. And I'm not quite sure I agree with that. And you know the reasons, having worked together on some of these issues. But just to highlight a few points, so calling these protests the last resort, that certainly was not my impression. That certainly was not my finding when I was working with you on these issues. These were never the last resort. So I'd like you to just say more about that. And then just as a so the point we're making about black victimization and black marginalization, you almost make it sound as if history goes in a straight line, so that what happened in 1652 is almost continuum to what happens now. And I find it quite problematic, and I'd like you to think more carefully about that. That's what I would say. There's a ton of questions. Let me stop there.
Okay, Francine.
Yeah, I think it's time a woman's voice comes out. Even though it was acknowledged, but not in the best way possible, Lucy. I just want to reinterpret, I think, you comment, is that I think the scenario in Brazil is actually more interesting and promising than the scenario in the other two countries. And the reason is that I think of all the discussion about the precariat and the forces to which it hook itself on is Brazil, because Brazil is a real social movement that links the precariat to the proletariat and the unions. Whereas I got a feeling in Spain, if I may say, this lovely story that you tell is actually a middle class story, predominantly. I mean, the Arab Spring, all that talks about educated people using social media. And indeed, middle class is disappearing in Europe, and particularly in the south of Europe. So I don't think it's as promising, although it's nice to have a new social movement, but that doesn't talk about capitalism, doesn't talk about exploitation and globalization and the inequality widening. The South African story is equally depressing because the precariat is indeed trying to save itself by dissociating itself from the other. And the other are the foreigners, and it looks like the woman are the other. So in asking you a question now, I think the three of you don't talk much about the leadership. And maybe there is no leadership that is easily pointable, but just in Spain at least, and maybe in South Africa. But I think leadership needs an emphasis in all your papers, and I just want to know if you have something to add about that.
Number three. Who was number three? Yeah. No.
We can just change the order then. It's fine. Since I have the mic. Okay. But my first question.
Sorry, what's your name?
Oh, sorry, my name.
Serial number.
Okay, my name is Melusi. I'm a PhD student. My first question is for Melusi. Yeah, your presentation was quite good. It sounded like, made me feel like I was watching a documentary of some sort. But you evoked the work of Chile and talked about the unpredictability of violence in the collective. But at the same time, you say some of your findings showed that violence is cyclical. Given the fact that in South Africa protests seem to be happening, not to change the system, but to change heads within the system. Isn't it high time that the predictability should be there, that we predict how this is going to turn out? Because I think this has been happening since the late 90s, since Thabo Mbeki's time, that people go, they change ANC councillors, they don't change anything else. So the issue of unpredictability, I think, in my view, might be out of question in respect to South African protests. I want to hear your thoughts on that. And for Alberto, I wanted to find out what the Greek experiences mean for the left in Europe. Because when they had their election, this party, Syriza, something sounds like Syria, but it's Syriza something, they had a very beautiful manifesto with very beautiful promises which made people hopeful in Greece. But then as we follow the news of late, well, my own hope was that we could just default and not pay IMF and stuff like that. But in the past few days we've heard that they're paying back, and they seem to be singing the old song again. So what does this mean for the left in Southern Europe or in Europe in general? And
Okay, sorry.
just
One question each.
the last comment.
Please, otherwise, because I've got seven. The one behind.
Okay, I'll ask you during
Yeah,
the
yeah.
tea break. Thanks.
One behind you. One question per person, please. Otherwise, a lot of hands went up.
Thanks. My name is Mzwake Mbata. I have two related questions, in particular for Marius. Obviously, it's a one question, but they are related. Yeah, I was extremely perturbed, or let me say amazed by, your presentation. To start with, you speak about political patronage and protest, but in the main, you do not define exactly the manifestation of this. I was taken aback as well by the dehumanizing aspect which you have articulated eloquently in this. But I think for me, we need to understand whether these protests are, spontaneous. Are they driven by any political agency? Are there any political formations? Are these protests initiated by the ruling party or any branch of the ANC, the EFF, or any formation? But there's no clarity regarding that. I think, lastly, for instance, this patronage, how does it manifest itself? What is it that, is provided as a patronage? Who is a receiver of this, and what happened? I think I need a bit of elaboration on that. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to give the speakers a chance to respond. There's quite a lot there. Who wants to start?
Thanks for all the questions. Let me start with your question, Devin. Like around who's the premier, who's being referred, like in this presentation. What I can say is not a Gauteng premier. And I think, like I said in my presentation, and I'm glad that Jacob is here, I think the difficulty that we had with this study, there was a lot of fear. Even when you read the report, we not mentioning names of towns, but I guess if you live in the area, you'll able to know the town that we're referring to. So obviously for many people, some of the interviews were done late as 2 a.m., some 24-hour KFC outlet. And people not want to be seen with me or Jacob. And going to Jacob's question around our community protests, a last resort, I make like an argument to say yes. And obviously here I'm relying on these two other communities, where more often, in fact, it's a story of like many communities, that what happens before the protest gets reported like in the media, there would have been many, in fact, very peaceful protests. So obviously people follow due democratic processes of writing letters and submitting memos and organizing marches to the municipality, and then nothing happens. So when I say, so obviously here when I say is where they become violent, I say is the last resort, but more often they're very peaceful. And then the issue around, yes, I agree. Obviously the analysis of black marginalization is not a straightforward sort of phenomenon. And obviously it was in the presentation, I was just trying to summarize some of the key points. And then in terms of the Malusi's question, around why not choose an alternative party. I mean, all the researchers in the project, we always wondered about that question. To say councillors will be removed and people will be very unhappy, but then they still vote for the same party. And one of the reasons that often gets given is that no, the problem is not with the party, the problem is with the individual. So there's always this hope that if we get this new individual, things might change, and then it becomes just a second and just a second and just a second. And I guess it also links with this optimism that when all these protests were starting and emerging, I guess there was a lot of optimism and excitement that there may be an emergency of an alternative party, but that has not happened. I mean, obviously people then form a concern group and a march gets organized, but then once the march is over and people have voted, things go back to normal. Even the concern group dies. So obviously so far there's no an alternative. And I guess it links with the last question, around the definition of the patronage system. Are they spontaneous, and who are the role players, and so on and so forth? Obviously, I mean, the picture is quite murky in a sense that when you go, at times the role players can clearly be identified, but their positions are not stable. They keep on shifting. I mean, depending, like I said in my presentation, on the political forces at that time. So like I said in the presentation, that today a person can be a protest leader, and when you go a few months later, this person is shifted. They can be in this group. When you go, they are no longer in that group. So people keep on moving and shifting from different groups.
Alberto,
Thanks.
I'm going to say something about it.
Okay. Thanks for the questions. I'm going to try to answer 3 of them. Well, the first one is about basic income in Brazil. Up to now, that's the official discourse of the government. Up to now, they are, according to them, they are trying to avoid cut social expense in order to sustain the investments on BFP program, for instance. So they are cutting in health, education, all those areas, but they are trying to avoid to cut social expense. That's the official discourse, because it doesn't make sense if you take into consideration the whole picture of the economy. If the economy is going down, the government cannot sustain the investments in basic income programs and so on. So it is quite complicated because government plays a key role on the behavior of the economy. And if the government is cutting the budgets and stuff, this cuts, they're gonna simply slow down the economy deeper. So that's the main reason, because it doesn't make sense. I mean, in one year or 2 years, maybe if the economy is still like that in Brazil, obviously the government will cut the investments in social expense and basic income and stuff. Yeah, so from Workers' Party to the protests. Well, the first movement of the Workers' Party was adopt the agenda, which was raised up during the protests after June 2013. Probably the main example of this was the program Mais Médicos, which was adopted by the Ministry of Health. Mais Médicos means more doctors. So they import thousands of doctors from Cuba in order to, spread out them and trying to reach that agenda, at least from a standpoint of health and the health system, which was well succeed. I would say. I mean, it is getting better in terms of health system and stuff. The health system is getting better with those guys working in the countryside and small cities and peripheral areas. But the problem is after that. I mean, after the election, and the government was recognized, despite all those problems. The government, the Dilma Rousseff's campaign was recognized, and she won. I mean, that's the contradiction. She won the election, and one day after this victory, she adopted the agenda of the guy who was beaten by her. I mean, she decided to promote sort of right-wing agenda and adopt the agenda of the right, the PSDB, the right political party, starting cutting budgets specifically in public education, which was huge in general terms, and health, and so that's the main problem. I mean, we are living a very tricky situation in the country right now, which means that the Brazilian government was elected with an agenda an agenda which the main purpose was to support employment, support the labor market, support the workers, support those guys who guarantee the victory of the Workers' Party, specifically the precariat, the guys who earn between 2 and 3 minimum wages in the country, which means not too much. I mean, I'm talking about families on average. So, and she decided, the government decided to attack them, cutting the budgets and adopting a very right-wing oriented agenda. So that's a problem. About the leadership, we haven't a clear picture about the leadership after June 2013 in Brazil. And in Portugal, happens more or less the same. I mean, in Brazil, maybe, probably, the main leader which emerged in the last cycle of protests after June 2013 was the leader of the MTST, the homeless movement, Guilherme Boulos. But even he's not very famous. I mean, he's not very recognizable among the ordinary people and stuff. But in Brazil right now we haven't this kind of, we have a sort of very strong and powerful process of creating leadership on grassroots, on social movements, but they are not very, I would say, recognizable. This is still working on. In Portugal, it happens more or less the same. The main leaderships which emerged in the last cycle of protests, they are trying to organize themselves in a platform, a political platform, 2 or 3 political platforms, like Tempo de Avançar. They are all the time trying to reproduce the Podemos experience from Spain. So it is very interesting. Tempo de Avançar maybe will be this political platform which will be well succeed in the next year or 2 years. But the leadership is not very clear, or this process is not very clear in the cycle of protests. Probably this due to the fact that the protest is really recent and very grassroots oriented. Against the political system, against the whole political system, against this kind of democracy system which is not very open to new guys or new leaders or new social movements. Anyway, thank you.
Too many questions, and I think really slow in English, so that's why I was giving them the microphone first. First, about the poverty not being seen in Barcelona. Well, it could be extremely frivolous on my side to try to compare both countries. That couldn't make any sense. It would be actually very disrespectful from me, and that wasn't my intention at all. Everywhere in Spain the polarization is going to be smaller than here. We are in the north, we are the south of the north, but we are the north nonetheless, and therefore social welfare, no matter how much they are cutting it, still works. And familiar networks also are being very important against the crisis. So yeah, it's impossible that you see the level of this violent dehumanization of this economic polarization here that takes place here. You're not going to see it anywhere in Spain. Nevertheless, Spain is the European country where inequality is growing faster. The level of inequality is growing to an unprecedented level, and you see poverty. I don't know exactly which years you were there, but if you go now, you'll see it clearly everywhere. If you just leave the tourist areas, it's there. As for the middle class thing, yes and not. Yes and not. It was in the beginning in the squares. I remember having this conflict all the time, because the discourses, they were not activist people. They were people with no political experience, and therefore the discourses were sometimes not very elaborated, so to speak, but their practices were amazing. They didn't have to use the words that you might use to explain what they were doing. They might not talk about exploitation or anti-capitalism or such, and even if you use those words, they might react like, oh, okay, another person trying to buy me something. That's what has been going on in Spain for the last many years. And so there's an interesting friction between discourses and practices, and the practices are real. We're not talking about only about middle class losing privileges. That's not what's happening in Spain. what you might be right is that workers' movement is not part of this process, but that's to blame on them. I mean, for many years in Spain, unions have been completely unable to include both migrants and precarious Spanish youth workers. So for the vast majority of the population, unions in Spain are part of the regime of the 78 that we were trying to destabilize. I mean, is anywhere, anyone you ask is going to tell you the same thing. And unions, I mean, they were really a strong political actor until mid-90s, all right? And then they were completely defeated. And once defeated, they joined the neoliberal party, and they are as corrupt as the traditional political parties in Spain. It's a shame, it's a pity, but that's how it is there. So we've been during many years talking about the need of creating new social movement unionism, as you mentioned before, how to create new tools for this new working reality that wasn't at all included in the unions. We hadn't the tools or the intelligence to do it properly, but well. As for the leadership, that's very interesting, because if 15 or the thing in the squares, there were no leaders at all. I mean, there was a very horizontal thing. If you ask, okay, tell me one name or remember one face or something, no one is gonna be able to give you a simple name. I mean, nothing. It was everybody. It's weird, but it's exactly as that. There are no proper names during 2011, 2012. Whereas the Podemos thing, the leadership is really strong, and this links to the social media aspect that you mentioned. The 15M thing happened in the social media. Podemos has happened in the social media, but mostly on mainstream TV. That's really surprising, but that's how it worked. I mean, for several years, they organized this alternative TV talk show is on the internet, and then they were like practicing this media language and media skills for years, and it became something bigger and bigger, and then mainstream companies started to call them into their own talk shows, and the rating just grew because you had a different voice, someone saying things that hadn't been said before, you know, and you had this guy with the ponytail and blah 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 just fighting the bad guys. So the leadership, it's really, because he speaks really well, and you know, he defeats everyone. So that's the thing. Like, he's like a male figure that is able to say the things that we want to say but that we cannot say, and that is able to shut all the other guys that are saying nonsense. And then you have the leadership of Ada Colau, and the one that I told you that could be winning the elections in Barcelona, and there's a complete different style. Okay, she's a woman, and she's not this patriarchal figure that knows it all. I mean, she's